Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Wednesday, July 24th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about the Week 1 questions that I have. We're only a month out from football happening, so we'll get to Week 0 and Week 1 questions, mainly Week 1, but definitely a little bit of Week 0 in there, because that's what I'm counting down to. I don't know about y'all, but then we'll talk about the 12-team playoff and how I tend to believe it's just going to be a little blip in college football history. Definitely something that I don't expect to see after the 2025 season. And I'll kind of get into details and break down why I don't expect to see it and what could kind of be the different path forward. Then we'll get into SMU. They have definitely been a little bit under the radar this offseason, have made their way into the ACC, and I feel like they're going to be at the top of college football for quite some time. I'll break down exactly what I mean by that a little bit down the road. Then we'll get into the top contenders. We'll talk about where their season is going to be decided. You always circle that 3 to 4 game stretch where you really became a championship contender. I'll break that down for the top 4 teams in the country going into this season. Then we'll do the hot takes for contenders. We'll continue that segment, get into the ACC today, a ton to break down in that conference. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcspodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. We get to kind of have a fun back and forth here, and I think that's always good for the both of us. So if you'd like to use that, again, that is gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump right in, and let's talk about all of the questions I have in Week 1 of college football. We are a month out from Week 0 kicking off, but that's what I'm counting down to anyways. We will definitely have one Week 0 question in here, but most of them will revolve around Week 1 because there's a lot of questions that will be answered on that day, and definitely a lot that we'll have to unpack after those games because there's a lot of big-time games and definitely a lot to learn about the teams in those games. So let's start this off, and the biggest thing that I'm learning, or I want to learn from the Week 1 games is, where are Riley Leonard and Connor Wegman at? Obviously, both of them had some injury troubles from a year ago, and both are coming in with a ton of hype going into this year. Riley Leonard wants to lead his team to a national title, and it's absolutely something that is in grasp for Notre Dame. On the other side, Connor Wegman has every ability to be a top pick in the NFL draft if he can put together a really good season this upcoming year because the tools are just absolutely off the charts for this kid. So I think both of them are coming in with a ton of hype, and they get to meet in Week 1, and it's going to be very, very interesting to kind of watch them go about their business because neither of these defenses are going to be easy to play against. I think A&M's is going to be a little bit easier, a little bit worse than Notre Dame's, but not by a lot, by any means. The Notre Dame one will be very interesting because you have guys on that back end like Benjamin Morrison, like Xavier Watts, that Connor Wegman's going to have to deal with, and they're very veteran guys that know how to take advantage of someone that maybe hasn't played too much football. So there's definitely a little bit of worry there, but if he can come out and absolutely sling the ball around, then I think we're talking about Connor Wegman in a totally different light coming out of that game. And as we move into Week 2 and into the SEC schedule especially, you're looking at A&M not only as a team that could, mess something up for one of the big boys, but could absolutely make some noise themselves and possibly even make it to an SEC championship game. So I think this is one of those games that I tend to believe it's the most interesting, the most fun, and the best game of Week 1, and I think it's largely because of these two quarterbacks. We're going to learn so much about these two guys that we didn't get to see near enough of from a year ago, and definitely want to see what they look like going into this year, particularly Riley Leonard, because he's been out for quite some time, and we'll learn a lot about those two guys, and whoever comes out on top is definitely off running for the 2024 season. So really excited to see what those guys have in store for us. But the other thing I kind of want to unpack here is, who are the guys on offense for Clemson? And this is kind of going to be a little bit harder to find an answer to in Week 1 because of how good UGA is likely going to be on the defensive side of the ball, particularly in that back end with Malachi Starks. And I think Dalen Everett is going to be one of the big-time breakout players in college football this year. But overall, we got to find someone, right? Cade Klubnik has to be able to find a couple of big-time players on that offense to get the ball to time and again. What's up, Anthony? Nice to see you. We have Tyler Brown as the guy that I'm circling, definitely the guy that I tend to believe is going to be the dude at wide receiver, at least early on in the season. I think he will be the go-to guy. And then you have Bryant Wesco, a really, really talented freshman that came in, someone that absolutely has a ton of hype, and I'll talk about him a little bit later in the show as well. But Adam Randall is someone else that I think could absolutely make some plays. They have Jake Burningstool at tight end, so there are plenty of guys. There's no two ways about that, but someone's got to show themselves, or at least a couple of guys have to show themselves as being legitimate options in that week 1 game. I'm not necessarily expecting anyone to go for 200 yards and tear up a Georgia defense, but at least show that you can, make the plays that Cade Klubnik needs you to make. And if they get totally bottled up and no one can make a play on the outside, maybe it's one of those seasons again for Clemson. But it'll be interesting to watch that because we might not get a straight answer just because of how good that defense is going to be for UGA this upcoming year. And then let's get into Miami. Wait, we got a question here from Anthony. Yeah, I mean, personally, I believe the wide receiver position is the biggest difference between the Clemson that was dominating college football and the Clemson now. And I think Bryant Wesco and TJ Moore coming in as freshmen are kind of that old crop of wide receivers, kind of getting back to what they used to have. So I think they're kind of getting right on the right path, but if those guys don't show up big this season, then we could still have that problem in Clemson, and I don't really know how long they have to fix it. So it'll be really interesting to watch that kind of unfold this season, but it feels like they're starting to figure that out. But let's get into Miami and talk about the 2024 season because we're going to learn if Miami's ready to take that next step. I understand that this game is going to be blown out of proportion quite a bit. Whoever loses this game is, the sky is falling for them. Whoever wins it is coming out with as much momentum as really anyone coming out of week 1. But at the end of the day, this is going to be a huge game for Miami. They're walking into a really hostile environment in the swamp. They're walking in with a ton of new guys that have to meld pretty quickly, including Cam Ward, their starting quarterback. So I think they have to be ready to roll, and if they can walk into the swamp and get a win, I really don't care how they do it, because frankly, this is going to be a close game. I can really not find any reason to think it's not going to be close. I think it's going to be an absolute battle, and it's going to be one of those games that you look up in the fourth quarter and maybe you have a 7-point game, but then Miami's got to make winning plays. And frankly, that was what was missing from last year's team, and that's for a myriad of reasons, including some of the coaching miscues that happened throughout the season. But overall, Miami's got to hit the ground running, and we're going to figure out if they're able to take that next step because no matter what Florida team you're playing, and this is still a pretty good Florida team, although the record might not show it at the end of the year, if you can walk into the swamp and get a big-time win, then you're ready to roll and you can play with pretty much anyone in the country, especially anyone in the ACC. So I think this would at least give us an idea of who Miami is and definitely give us an idea of can they walk into these hostile environments and keep their composure and make those winning plays that just kind of eluded them a year ago. But we also have Texas. I think it's very interesting because this is a very under-the-radar game, a game that not a lot of people are thinking about. Texas is playing Colorado State. Texas should likely win by 14, 21, 28 points, whatever have you. But at the end of the day, I think there's going to be a ton of answers from this game, and I think the biggest thing here is Colorado State loves to throw the ball around. That's what they do. Braden Fowler Nicolosi is very, very comfortable in this offense, and they push the ball around the field. That plays into exactly what Texas really struggled with a year ago. They could not get to the quarterback in the pass rush, and their secondary was not very strong down the stretch. Definitely got beat deep just way too many times, and we'll be able to see if they can handle that this upcoming year, if they've taken real concrete steps to kind of fix that problem. So both places are much better than they were a year ago. You add a guy like Trey Moore to the pass rushing unit that has Colin Simmons coming in as well, a very talented freshman, Barron Sorrell, Ethan Burke. There's going to be plenty of guys that can rush the passer, so I think there will be okay there, but at the end of the day, it was something that they were talking about, I believe, on Texas Football, where they were saying they got to get at least 3 sacks on this. They got to get 3 sacks in this game, and they have to have at least somewhat of a stifling pass defense if I'm going to feel confident about this Texas defense going into this year. So I think that's the biggest thing. It's not necessarily going to be a game where you learn everything about Texas defense, but there's definitely a couple of things that Colorado State likes to do that plays into some of the things Texas struggled to do a year ago, and we'll figure out if those are fixed issues or if they're going to carry into 2024. Definitely will be a very, very interesting thing. And then, yeah, definitely Anthony brings up a great point. Once you start SEC play, it's a totally different game, but we'll at least learn a little bit about what those two units have in store for Texas this upcoming season. And then you have a ton of other stuff to kind of break down going into week one. He had a question here, excuse me. I think it's one of those things. If Miami goes in and beats Florida, I think it would be a huge win for the program and absolutely catapult them. At the end of the day, what happens in the ACC is really going to be the end-all, be-all. And for Florida, it might hold more weight, if I'm being totally honest with you, this game, because you have to start the season strong because the back end of this schedule is an absolute nightmare. So it could be that Billy Napier, if he loses this game, is in trouble the entire rest of the year because, frankly, it's really hard to find 6 wins right now. So if Miami is a loss as well, then you're going to have a ton of trouble going into the back end of this year. So it could be that is the end-all, be-all for him, that it starts, the end of his career at Florida. But it could be the kickstart of a really good year and keep him in town because I think he's a really good coach. I just think that's a program that had a lot to fix when he showed up. But it'll be really interesting to watch. That's obviously one of the big-time talking points going into this year. But let's continue on here and talk about Penn State because I think we're going to learn a little bit about them offensively. The thing about this one is Penn State and West Virginia played a year ago, and Drew Aller was incredible. He was absolutely awesome, and he was awesome in a lot of games that weren't Michigan and Ohio State. And that's obviously the big-time step that he has to take this year is show up in those big-time games. So maybe we won't exactly learn, has Drew Aller taken that next step, but we will see what this offense looks like under Andy Kotelnicki, the new offensive coordinator, and we'll see if it has a bigger ceiling. I think there was some parts of that game where, yes, the offense was moving and they were doing what they wanted to do, but it wasn't necessarily quite as clean as you wanted it to be at times. And I think one of the biggest things for Penn State is just keep everything moving. And then West Virginia on the other side is definitely going to be a better defense this time around. So I think it'll be really interesting to watch this. But overall, this could be the same old Penn State. This could be a team that is, fully capable of dominating a team like West Virginia. But then when Ohio State rolls into town, you got a whole other problem. So I think it's going to be really interesting to watch all of that. But we really won't get a firm answer about this offense until they get into Big Ten play, and especially until they play Ohio State, because that's where, the real difference between old Penn State and hopefully the new Penn State is really going to be made. And yeah, absolutely, James Franklin does have kind of the same problem that Mario Cristobal has had with some of the clock management issues down the stretch, and it's cost him games, especially in those big-time games that have kept him from taking that next step. But let's get into Florida State here, and let's talk about the offense in particular, but overall this team, how fast can they meld? Because they really kick off the season with 2 games that they're not necessarily overly scary on paper, but they're dangerous games. You play Georgia Tech in Ireland, which is a game that there's just so many variables. You never really know what can happen in that game. I tend to believe it's going to be close one way or the other. And then you have Boston College on Monday night in Tallahassee. So it's going to be really interesting to watch, but they got to get rolling pretty quickly, especially on the offensive side of the ball. They definitely need to get things rolling because Georgia Tech's going to score points. I can almost promise you that. Even against this really good defense, I think they're going to be able to move the ball down the field and definitely score some points. And if you don't come ready to return that, then you could have a problem on your hands. So I don't necessarily think they're in danger of losing these games outright, but let's say they walk into that Ireland game and win 24-21, and then they beat Boston College by 4 points, by 7 points. I wouldn't feel great going into the rest of the season. Obviously, you get 2 big conference wins to start the year, but you definitely don't, inspire a lot of confidence among your fan base going into this year, and you have a lot of bigger games down the stretch that will cause problems if, those first 2 cause problems for you. So I think we'll learn at least a little bit about where DJ's at, where these wide receivers at, where Roy Dell Williams is at, and we'll at the very least get to see, how far this team has come in pretty short amount of time putting together a whole team. Yeah, I think that's one of the things, Anthony. It kind of is the ultimate equalizer, going across seas, having those jet lag issues. Some of these guys haven't flown out of the U.S. before. Some of these guys haven't been on a plane. So it's going to be a very, very interesting thing and something that is going to be fascinating to unpack. But that doesn't even include some of the questions around the Colorado game, where is Colorado the team that we think they all are going to be, or is North Dakota State going to cause some problems? Can UGA start in absolutely dominating fashion and move towards a third title in 4 years? And is West Virginia a Big 12 contender? Because if they compete or maybe even beat Penn State, they definitely are. So it'll be absolutely awesome to watch those Week 1 games. They are getting closer and closer by the day, so cannot be more excited. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the 12-team playoff and how I tend to believe it's just a blip on the college football history book. So I'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.